Hi, my name is Matilda Siebrecht, aka the Archaeologist Teacup, and today I will be talking to you about my presentation, Better Than Fiction, Exploring Alternative Methods of Accessible Archaeological Communication. And by communication I mean not just to the general public or those outside of the field of archaeology, but also to our colleagues, both within academic research of archaeology, but also into the broader field of cultural heritage management and other archaeological fields. First of all, let's consider how we actually learn about the past, both as archaeologists, but also those of the general public. There's lots of different methods. So of course, the most common method is through academic publications. However, there are many issues with academic publications which have been talked about many times before. For one thing, there is a bit of an issue with accessibility for those of us outside of academia. Nobody knows where to find them for a start, especially if you haven't actually ever been into the academic field. So what if you're interested in finding out about a particular research topic or a particular project that's going on, but you don't have any affiliation with an institution that enables you to access these academic papers? Quite often as well, especially if you're outside of academia, you need to pay multiple fees in order to be able to view them. The scientific language used within these papers is often quite specific to that particular theme, so therefore it's sort of unapproachable in terms of the language used, and it's very difficult for, again, those outside the, not even the field, but even the topic, that particular topic of research, to understand what's going on. And here I have a lovely quote from Fritz and Plog, 1970. "Unless archaeologists find ways to make their research increasingly relevant to the modern world will find itself increasingly capable of getting along without archaeologists." This is something that I actually talked about in last year's talk, a little bit about why we need to make our research more approachable and accessible to the general public, so I won't go into too much detail of that. But it is something that sort of ties in a lot to why it's important to have accessible means of communicating archaeological research. The second way that you can find out about academic research or archaeological research is through digital platforms. So for example, social media, science communication is a big one that I participate in, and I'm sure a lot of the speakers here participate in as well. There's things like podcasting, YouTube videos. All of these are very accessible, very approachable. However, they are not considered academically viable, which is interesting because the use of these social media platforms, if you can see in the graph on the bottom right over there, has really dramatically increased in the last couple of years alone. So it's amazing. It's a platform that can really be used a lot more. Again, this is something I talked about last year, so I'm not going to go into too much detail now. So we have academic publications, digital platforms, but we also have visual media. And by this I mean, for example, video games, which we talked about a lot in session 1, fantastic session. So you have things like Assassin's Creed and other examples that were given there, which as this is pre-recorded, I'm afraid I don't know exactly which examples were given yet. You also have, for example, popular films such as Indiana Jones, the first one that comes to mind. You also have Lara Croft. However, the question remains as to how accurate these depictions of historic scenes actually are. And there's been lots and lots of research done on this in terms of archaeogaming, but it's interesting to look at in terms of the films. There's always lots of reviews given by archaeologists afterwards. Archaeologists React on YouTube, one of my personal favourite series of videos to, for example, the latest Indiana Jones film, and how although it does depict actual archaeological relics or artefacts, it doesn't necessarily always give a very accurate depiction of those artefacts. And these, we could argue, are definitely not considered academically viable. So then you have the fourth example, which is something that I want to talk a little bit more about today, which is popular fiction and non-fiction. I can guarantee that the majority of us here first got our glimpse into archaeology or history. That first spark of interest was sparked by something that we read or potentially watched, and it was very likely that that thing was actually fictional, so not real. However, it sparked our imagination, and perhaps it was research to an accuracy that enabled us to actually find out the real information behind it, and that was what got us into archaeology in the first place. So the great thing about these is that it provides that base knowledge, that base understanding, that base spark that can then be expanded on through more scientific methods. Some great examples of these are things like Horrible Histories. For those of you who don't know that, it's a British series of books which presents the history in a sort of fun way. It's aimed at children, and it's very approachable, and it's very easy to remember because it's presented in an almost cartoonized format. There's lots of, fun or disgusting facts that are thrown in there at different times. Another example of slightly more serious fiction is something like Wolf Hall, which again is fictional, but it is so based in historical accuracy that you could almost get a quite decent understanding of the historical period by reading it. And the great thing with these sort of more popular fiction and non-fiction is that they connect with our emotions. They're often associated with nostalgia or memories, and they spark ideas within us that remain with us for longer because of that emotional connection. Because of course they also use accessible and approachable language. So this brings me on to the Archaeo Book Club, which is something that I founded last year. Can't believe it's been a year already. And the aim of this book club was to see how archaeology is depicted in popular fiction of today. It's now expanded actually to include non-fiction and various other things as well. But the main idea of it was to see, okay, if we want to communicate archaeological ideas through fiction to the public, how accurate is that already happening? How accurate is it already taking place? The answer is varied, depending on the genre most of the time. Sometimes it's the research that's gone into the archaeological background of the story is fantastic, and as an archaeologist you can really recognize things as they come through. Sometimes it's a little less accurate, shall we say, in its depiction of what archaeologists do. A lot more Indiana Jones style type thing. But there are ways that you can write fictional accounts which can still remain true to the original kind of history or the archaeology behind it. So a great example of this is something called ancient fan fiction, which is run by the Ancient Studies Alliance, SASA, and they say that our stories are mainly about ancient individuals whose experiences have been neglected too often by historians. With every fictional account, we provide scholarly research in the form of articles, blog posts, and podcasts so that you can dig deeper into the actual history behind a narrative. And I've highlighted here what I think are the really important points of this, is that in fiction, or even popular non-fiction, you can look at those stories that aren't necessarily considered viable for an academic research project, but nevertheless are still important and still allow people to dig deeper into what actually happened in the past. So to move a little bit from fiction to then popular non-fiction, here are some great examples of popular non-fiction books who have been in the bestseller lists even, that are written by archaeological researchers, but they're aimed at a much wider audience. They're aimed at non-archaeologists, but still as an archaeologist you can actually read it and also be really interested in what's happening because they are written by scientists, they are written by academic researchers who know what they're talking about. So you can also learn something. And what I find interesting is, similar to what we just mentioned before, they focus on something that they consider urgent, which is kind of often a theme within fiction or non-fictional accounts of archaeology, something that's needs to be talked about and something that needs to be almost proved. And this is actually very similar to what happens in academic writing. The reason that you're doing your research project is because it's something that you feel that is important, that needs to be shared with the rest of the academic community. So the question is, why is it then not the norm to write in these more accessible styles that can be approached by both academic and researchers as well as those outside the profession? And the answer is, of course, peer review, because quite often these popular non-fictional books or other popular books aren't submitted to the rigorous academic peer review that is required for it to be widely accepted by the rest of the academic field. Now, there have been many posts and articles and all kinds of things that have been saying that peer review really needs to update, because peer review is something that is so entrenched within academia, within archaeological research, but actually it's an extremely old-fashioned way of approaching the dissemination of archaeological knowledge. Now, I am not saying at all that we shouldn't review articles before they are released, or we shouldn't review information before it is kind of published. But there's a difference between reviewing it in the rigorous way that it's being done now and reviewing it in a rigorous but then approachable and more accessible way that it could be done, which would encourage those people not just to submit scientific publications, but also to submit other forms that can be submitted to just as rigorous a review process. And an example of that, in a way, is our keynote speaker for today, Dino Kaspari, who wrote a fantastic publication on the use of social media for archaeological research dissemination. And the published article itself was, of course, peer-reviewed. But why should the raw data, the social media posts themselves, not be considered as academically viable as the finally published paper? Of course, it's because of the platform. It's because of people's experience about the platform and how they see the platform and interact with it in their mind. But this is something that I should argue could change. So this isn't necessarily a kind of research project that I'm presenting today. I'm more trying to provide an example of ways that maybe the field could develop further into the future. And I'm presenting it here because we have a lot of early career researchers and young researchers who are joining us today. And I think that it's really important to share the message that you shouldn't be afraid to try something new just because it's always been done this way in the field of academia, in the field of archaeological research. We've had some great presentations in this session. We're going to have, I should say, about alternative ways that you can present information to the public, which is still as rigorously researched and should still be therefore as respected and accepted by the rest of the academic community as a peer-reviewed academic article. So thank you very much for listening to my little lecture today. If you're interested in finding out more about the Archaeo Book Club, by the way, here are our details. And if you're interested in learning a bit more about my rigor for science communication on popular platforms,